So from a requirement standpoint, you're going to start talking about timelines right away. And what I would say I would encourage you to do is definitely get a handle on what the expectations are for your timelines. Those may be aggressive, right? You may have a very specific need you're trying to meet, has to be done by, June 30th or something like that. Understand, get a handle on what those initial expectations are, but try to keep an open mind about what's actually going to happen. Once you find out some things, you want to, and ideally have some give and some cushioning in those timelines, some room to solve problems, some room to do things a little differently. So this is the point in time where you want to think about what are your key tasks, though. If you have a timeline that you're trying to meet, you're going to have to do that report inventory. You're going to have to do some of the maybe a POC that we'll talk about a little bit later, prioritizing everything in the right order. You might need to go out and find resources, which I'll talk about, but also don't forget security is going to be something that you may not have thought of. It may have been handled completely different in your other tool, and now you've got something different to approach. And then never forget and never underestimate the need you may have for data model updates. BI tools, often we design semantic models that are very suited for that particular tool. And we build logic in different ways in each of our tools. And you're going to maybe encounter some experiences where you've built a really, really wide table in Tableau, but that doesn't exactly work and perform that well in Power BI. So data model updates are something you want to put something in there. If you've got some, just as you're doing your initial planning, put some place marks, just mark a space for those types of tasks, because I guarantee they're going to come up. And then like I said, putting in some cushion for potential roadblocks. And don't forget your user involvement. Know what timelines you're looking at, and is this going to land on budget season? Is this going to land in a place where some of your stakeholders are all going to be off somewhere and you're not going to be able to get their time? So try to think about all of those things when you're looking at your anticipated timelines. Try to put your project on a delivery that's going to set you up for success, so that when you get to that UAT, you're not sitting and suddenly waiting, or if you get to that roadblock, you've got that time already. We had 3 weeks built in to handle that. Let's get it done. And then the governance aspect is, there's a setup and there's a cadence. You're going to want to make sure you've got time for people to attend those, time to get that set up and going if you don't already have governance in place for your BI organization. In terms of resources you're going to need time from are stakeholders. I know I've been asked before to come and do things where IT comes and they say, we need you to do this. It's just IT. You can't talk to the business. It's not my ideal situation. Sure, we get it done, but I really think trying to migrate forward without the input from your stakeholders, without the input from report subject matter experts, you're bound to face problems that you didn't know. You're going to migrate things that didn't need to be migrated. You're going to think that you've got to format things a very specific way, or you're going to try to replicate something, and you don't understand the use, and you don't understand actually they might have been pretty flexible about that. So build in time, put in the expectations that you're going to need some of their time. As you go to plan your project, try to be efficient, of course, with the time from people like that. And when I talk about report SMEs, that might be a report developer, but don't forget that might be an analyst. That might be the person that requested the report. Your stakeholders could be SMEs. It could be an executive, a CEO, a CFO, who's definitely one of what you consider a stakeholder in the game, but also one of the people who knows the most about how a report is used. And then your project plan in general should include a project manager. I think that's fairly obvious, but you're also going to want development experts. Start thinking about who those are. Do you need DesignMind? Do you need someone like us to come in and help and be your Power BI trusted advisor? There are a lot of great expertise out there that you could potentially leverage, but also within your own organization, if you've got experts in the existing tool, it's a great time to think about utilizing them, making sure you've got them on the timeline, and making sure, we're going to talk in a second about training, but making sure those people are also going to be the ones, ideally, that you train up in your new tool. They're going to be your key person, because knowing the two technologies is really critical to making sure parameters are done differently in this tool. How is that going to work over here? Having that expertise helps you really assign and understand complexity a lot better of your migration. And then I add on data engineers. That's gonna be a common theme. You may be thinking I'm not touching the data model, but I feel like it's really important to plan to at least have some data model flexibility and some data engineering expertise on your team. You may even choose to do something with Azure. In that case, you might want an Azure data engineer. And then make sure when you're going through this project plan, you might have a set of experts set to help you migrate, but don't forget that at the end of that project, you've got an environment that's up, it's running, and it's going to need to be built on. And you want to make sure you're planning for all of the resources you're going to need going forward. Admins, people who understand the setup and the environments, that type of thing. And then I talk about success criteria because I think it's important. I think one of the first things you want to ask is, why are we doing this? You think you might know, but I think it's important to ask everyone who's involved in making that decision, what's the reason? What's driving our move? Is it user experience? Our users need more. We want users to be able to do more self-service or dig down deep, and they're really comfortable with Power BI because users have gotten to know Power BI from using Excel, and then they build on it and start using Power Query, and they get really excited. And so maybe that's driving your need. Whatever's driving it, though, is going to help you define the resources and the timelines for sure, because if something that may be driving it is cost, you're going to need to maybe accelerate components of your migration accordingly. If you've got a licensing cost, a license, typically when you go to do something like this, everybody looks at, well, what's our current contract? Okay, this one's up here. If we start this one, we don't want to overlap them for too long. So thinking about if cost is an issue, then you're going to want to look, and when we talk about prioritization and we talk about the inventory that you're taking and then analyzing usage of your existing reports, knowing if that's one of your considerations is definitely going to drive a lot of your activities. I think also knowing, though, too, a little bit about your report, your report users, your report audience, if they're willing to be flexible with their requirements. I think if you ask any user, hey, can we change your reports? They're going to say no. But if you go to them and you say, okay, it turns out that I can't do your report this way, but I can do it a different way. It's going to give you the same result, but slightly different. A lot of times they're like, oh, okay, that's fine. I understand that I can get to use, get to know that. But you may have a dashboard that is, painstakingly formatted, and they spent 6 months designing it, and absolutely it can't change. So that is the kind of success criteria you want to know a little bit more about. You may not know it for every report right away, but getting an idea or a sense of that from your user community, from your developer community. Your developers are going to know those reports. They're going to say, you're going to be in a meeting and you can talk, and they'll say, hey, there's like 5 reports that I know that they've got to be a lift and shift, right? It can't be any different. So make sure you cover some of that ground early. These are the early migration requirement questions as you're asking yourself before you even get started. And then I think really understanding too, we're talking about moving reports, but what are the new development, or really, are there any self-service requirements? Self-service is a little different, and if you've been using, and again, I call on my MicroStrategy experience, but that was a very report builder, lots of wizards, business objects is the same way. If they're used to that type of environment, this is going to be a little different, and you might want to plan for that. You can plan to build out some real clean, user-friendly models that can be used to build new reports, set up a specific environment for that. But also take that into the next cube here, and that's training, and making sure as you approach your project that you think about what training is needed. And don't just think, I need to train everybody in Power BI development, right? Everybody just needs to know how to do it. You're definitely going to need that training. That's what I call user training, maybe development training. Some users are going to stay in your report service. Some are going to get into desktop. Probably a good hybrid of both is what you're going to see. So definitely plan for that training. Don't do it right away, right? Users do best when they're trained and immediately using a tool. So try to plan for that training. If you start fitting in your timelines, you start thinking, well, we're going to start delivering, some of this. We'll put that group in here because they'll start getting their reports around this time. So try to start thinking about how you coordinate that training effort to make sure users aren't trained. And then 6 months later, after we've gotten through our problems or situations, and then they're looking at it and thinking, I don't remember any of that training. So there's some great stuff out there. Microsoft has got some great stuff, just even poking around online. You've got Dashboard in a Day that a lot, we're able to deliver. And then I think just one of the most important things to consider, I'm going to mention this a few times because I've just encountered it enough, is administrative training. Somebody who's well-versed in the Power BI admin role. You may have like an Office 365 architect or, somebody who's in charge of that, but they're maybe not going to know the Power BI side of things. And if that's the case, I still highly recommend, even if that person is maybe developer and admin, because I could see, I definitely could see an argument where you say, well, admin role, it's not a full-time thing because a lot of Power BI is, the user publishes it, right? They set the refresh schedule. Once I've set up all the environments, isn't it kind of self-sufficient? And to an extent it is, but I know personally, just when I first started using Power BI, I started asking around at my company and I said, they just kind of started using Power BI with none of this in place, no thought process behind it. And I said, okay, so where's the Power BI admin who can tell me how I make sure I have a service account and a gateway and I can actually refresh my reports without, I literally had a laptop on my desk that we left on just so it could act as a personal gateway, which is crazy. So thinking about that ahead of time, my company, they'd had someone, they would have said, oh, great, we'll get your gateway. What are your connections? Do you have a service account? Somebody who can help you manage those processes. So users like me in that situation don't just go do it on their own, set up something quick and dirty and make things a problem later, because for sure that was a problem later, right? My laptop crashed. I couldn't refresh any of my reports. If we'd put in some of that foresight and put an admin in place, I would have had all the resources I needed. The environment would have been ready for me to do what I needed to do. So I'll pause a second for questions. I've been talking for a few minutes now.
No, I was just going to say I did exactly the same thing. I did a personal gateway when I was just investigating what was going on, how to do it. And then I dug into it further. And then they said, wait a second, you don't need to do that. And I said, I was just trying to mess around. And then after that, it was like, it lasted about a month. That's about it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I did the exact same thing. It was like, well, let me just set this up. Then suddenly everyone liked my reports and I couldn't find anywhere else to go for them. So I knew I needed an enterprise gateway, but we didn't really have one that I could easily tap into. So.
So Rosa did post a question in chat, and she's asking, would you recommend using the source model's metadata, like she uses, for example, business objects, to build reports in Power BI in a migration, or just be building everything from scratch?
Definitely, and I have a slide later that definitely digs into some of that, but for sure your metadata, from telling you the usage, I know in less experience with business objects in that area, but I know in MicroStrategy, we could always query or see who had used what and when, just like you can in Power BI. So there's that component, which is, being able to query, what's actually out there, what's being used. But I believe your metadata is going to be instrumental in telling you a lot of the business logic that's already been applied, right? You don't want to have to build, I don't think you should have to build from scratch. I think you should have, expertise in the area of like a business objects person who can say, well, here's the filters we set up, here are the measures we set up, here's the universe, right? We've got these 5 universes, and you're going to use that type of information to help you get to where you need to go. It won't be, it's not ever going to be, I think, don't anticipate that it's going to be a one-to-one, right? And I've still encountered people who say, well, is there like a button I can push that just converts them? I kid you not, I've definitely been asked that many times. Same with migrating from like a database platform, and there's no magic button and there's no magic answer, but definitely that metadata is really great that you've, the fact that it exists, you want to leverage that for sure.
And Elena added a comment that her company locked down the personal gateways, but that there are backdoors that she identified, that SharePoint, Excel workbooks, Flow to force research, plus Power BI data flows, schedule refreshes. So there are some workarounds that were also available. Of course, I think part of your message is work with the organization so that the workarounds are not required. But
I mean,
we're stuck in the real world, right?
Yep. It's definitely, I'm going to tell you what I recommend, and then I've been that user, so I totally understand that.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
All right. So when you're taking your report inventory, so just like Rosa was asking about, using audit logs or metadata or databases that exist in your current platform, leverage those wherever you can. Some can be queried. I know if you keep Tableau server usage data, you can query that and determine report owners. You can determine who's using it and how much they're using it. So a lot of the tools are going to have some way of doing that. And that particular thing should also present to you somewhat of an inventory. But I do think it's important to not just go out and seek that inventory on your own, but rather confirm that inventory, maybe even receive it from your users, from your stakeholders. Maybe it's IT, maybe IT got the list from somebody. When you get that list, confirm it. If you go and get it on your own, confirm it with what you're receiving. If you receive it, go confirm it with what you're seeing in the metadata too. Have discussions and make sure we're all agreeing on the same list of reports, because that could be kind of awful, right? To get to the end of your project and realize we all missed the most important report because somebody was running it on their desktop. Tableau has Tableau server, but somebody maybe was running something and emailing it to everyone in an Excel spreadsheet, right? There's a lot of little underlying places where reporting could be happening. You want to try to tap into those as much as possible. But try also to get a handle on how those reports are currently grouped, because that's going to help you define that environment. Like if you're going to set up different workspaces and set up different security groups or things like that, starting off by getting your inventory of reports sectioned off in some way. If you're using something like business objects, it may be that you start with just universes, right? Or if you're using Tableau, it might be certain connections or a certain set of reports that are owned by a particular group. And so organizing that by group, and then I cannot emphasize this enough, knowing what your data sources are. Tools like Business Objects, MicroStrategy, Cognos, they're probably going to tend to be using something that's already integrated, right? It's probably already going to have a single source. I know those tools have added capabilities to add in, users have been able to add in their own data and do things like that now in the last few years. But where you're going to encounter certainly a lot of different data sources are probably more in those tools like Tableau or things like that, where people are using various sources. I've seen Tableau reports with 12 different data sources being combined into one file, and they may not even be joined, but you got a lot of those blended things, and there's a lot of digging you're going to have to do. But understanding what your data sources are is going to be really important, because some are going to be a little more challenging to work with, possibly in Power BI, and some are going to be pretty simple and straightforward to move right in. So determining your data sources, and then extremely critical to understand where security sits. If security sits in your database layer, that's great, except that you may decide you're going to import your data in Power BI. In fact, you most likely will. So really consider where your security sits, because you're going to want to replicate that with row-level security in Power BI, most likely. And you're going to want to make sure you've got all that logic. You've pulled the inventory for, looking at the reports, you're going to analyze that and know which ones have security, which ones don't, what type of security does it have, and where does that security sit. Those are the types of things you want to know from your inventory. You don't have to know too much about how hard it's going to be yet, but get the answer and know the answer before you start diving in. Determining key calculations and KPIs. That's obviously a critical one. I find that in some places you're going to have a very structured list of the current measures, and in some places you're going to have a huge list of user-built measures. And you may need to just kind of gather them all together. And I have at the bottom of this list here, but it's important to this area as well, which is you're going to want to combine and put those together in some places. I've seen definitely where people are defining the same measures over and over again in a report, and ideally you can capture that and consolidate that into a single place or single source of truth, whether that be in a data flow in Power BI or a model or something else. And then understanding your interactivity, how is the user interacting with this report? Are they the 5 filters on it? Do they switch columns? Are they just switching measures? There's a lot of that goes on, I think, in Tableau-based reports where you can click and create a parameter that switches what columns are on your report. And it's not quite as simple to do that in Power BI. So knowing which reports have that type of functionality available is going to go a long way to getting you ahead of what's going to be more complex and making sure you define it that way. Printing and exporting is going to be important in case you've got something like if you've got a big tabular report that's being generated and everybody just looks at it's a big table, you might have a great opportunity for a paginated report in Power BI. So understanding if people are using that for printing or if they're just downloading a giant grid every week, right? You might have an opportunity to do something a little different, but you want to make sure that you're, as you gather that inventory, you know that about your report. And then I think these 2 bullets go together, but known issues. Is there something going on with this report? Is it broken? I definitely did an inventory recently, earlier this year, and I would open the report and be like, I actually can't look at it because it's broken. It doesn't work. So what's happening with that? Do I have the right version? Am I looking at this correctly? And you may need to put that on the list of things that I'm going to talk to that user group when I get their time. Hey, we looked at this report. It doesn't seem like it's working. They'll say, oh yeah, we know about that. We're working on it. So-and-so's developing a solution. So you can go out and find so-and-so who's developing that solution, figure out what that is and jump onto that, that work stream as well. And then really important as you look at your inventory is identifying opportunity for improvements. And I'm going to talk about this in the best practice slide as well, but looking for the opportunity to combine and eliminate reports is so critical. A lot of reports get created. Whenever you've got a tool, there's typically a way for users to build their own reports, and those are going to make it on the list, right? User reports, you may have some that are enterprise and sanctioned, but users share reports all the time, and they're scheduled and they're, subscribed to, and they're going to expect those reports to show up for them as well. And you're going to find that a lot of them, hey, did they just filter differently? Is there some way that we could set this up so that we, don't have to build 6 reports? We can just build 1 with a slicer or something like that. Is there an opportunity to, I'm going to talk about this a lot, but share data sets or share, use data flows as a means to consolidate and reduce redundancy. So look for those opportunities as you build your inventory. Keep, obviously, usually like a spreadsheet is what I've done in the past. I keep a spreadsheet of all the reports on a list, and I start just kind of keeping track of them. I start with a list of the report names, and I go through and start looking at all the different calculators. There's 10 different calculations. 5 of them are complex. You might want to look at things like slicers or filters or how many pages or visuals are on there. And I think skip to the next slide and show you as it comes to prioritizing. And what I'm going to say here is that as you build your inventory and understand what you have, and you go to prioritize and plan how to actually migrate it, they all sort of come together. And that's why I have this kind of matrix here that says, we're going to basically look to assign complexity, right? I'm going to assign how hard is this report? So a lot of those questions we were asking from that last slide, a lot of those, how many KPIs are there? What's the issue? How many data sources are there? That's going to help you drive your complexity, and you'll actually be surprised how much you can actually discern just from kind of opening a report and scanning it and looking at how much is going on in that report. You'll be able to see the complex ones bounce right off at you, right? 16 data sources, or it's got, 20 different prompts and filters that there are users expected to answer. But when you go to prioritize it, you're looking at things like, is there a cost of licensing that we're looking? If I've got 50 people on a license in this group and 10 on a license in this group, I might want to get those folks off sooner, right, than my other group of people. So maybe they're my higher priority, but their stuff is maybe in the medium to low complexity. Puts them as a great candidate to be kind of at the top of your list as you make a ranking of how you're going to do things. And then, you're also going to have things that are just obviously high usage but low complexity. That's another great place to start because you're going to get a quick win and a lot of adoption right away and a lot of, yahoos, good jobs, that gets people, happy to see what's happening and they see progress. So my recommendation is that you build out a matrix, right? That spreadsheet I talked about is a great start. You build out that spreadsheet, you start assigning, maybe come up with a scoring system that works based on your business and those success criteria that we talked about earlier. And, figure out whether you've got small, medium, or complex from a complexity standpoint and kind of come up with a ranking, but think then in terms of, and then call upon a client that was wanting to do this where they said, hey, we want to actually do this in phases. And we want to group, these together and do 10 small, 10 medium, 10 complex. Like we want to do small, medium, complex, then small, medium, complex. Like kind of think about how you want to organize that and then adjust your ranking however it makes sense to fit that. But knowing what that inventory is, knowing what's in those reports, and then understanding what usage, what what executive level requirements, what's going to drive the order in which you deliver those, and put that together and get your plans built from there. So identifying challenging components and drilling in before finalizing your timelines is basically doing what I just said, like kind of taking out, looking at what drove that complexity, but start looking at things like data sources, looking at things that functionality that you're not going to be able to replicate. I really, really, really recommend that as you go into the planning stages and you're building this more detailed project plan. So we started off with kind of an initial timeline. We're drilling a little further in. We're going to build out that project resource plan now that we know what's to be done, right? What's actually got to be delivered. And as we start building that out, where you want to add things in, maybe you want to group these reports into a group or something, is looking for things with challenging data sources, a lot of different data sources combining to make one report. Am I going to need data engineering for that? Maybe, right? I might need to actually plan for that. The other place you're going to want to look for is if you've got a tool that's doing live queries, Bob J, maybe MicroStrategy, where they generate the SQL and hit the database right away, versus importing all the data. That's a big switch, and don't anticipate that direct query is going to solve all your problems. Direct query is great and can be used, but it's not if you've used direct query before, you've hit that wall, right? Where the user asks for something, it's too, I've got to build a calculated column, or the row level security can't be built the way it wants to be built. So you're gonna want to limit what you do direct query with to make sure that it's gonna work, and that you're using import in other places where you can. And I've got some other recommendations around this area as well a little later in my presentation. So building out the project plan, that's just project Excel, however you like to build that, but making sure you have a PM and a tech lead, someone who can make decisions. The PM's going to go drive, right? They're going to go out and find answers to questions, and when you hit bottlenecks, go get resources and maybe money to solve that problem, right? If I need to switch out a data source with another data source, or move things around, or conduct some ETL, that's probably going to be something I have to implement some cost to, and they're going to have to go talk to people to get that done or clear the way for you. If you hit IT roadblocks, right? Hey, I can't get access to these databases. You need a PM to help you navigate that road. Your technical lead is going to tell you, though, what the things I'm talking to you about a little bit, right? What can be done, what can't be done, what challenges are surmountable, and what ones do we need to stop and come up with a new solution for. And then just make sure you've got QA, plan for QA. You know your test criteria going in. How are the users going to look at this? Are you looking, like, if you go to do your inventory, make sure you know how things are being filtered, because if you look at it and it's got like a static filter in it, sometimes things change a little over time. So keep an eye on things like that. And then I mentioned this earlier, but plan, set aside time for your users to do UAT as appropriate. And as soon as you know when that timeline is going to be and you're pretty sure of it, that's when I would say, go in and check with those groups and make sure they're going to be available. So I'll pause there again. Been talking again for a little bit.
There are no questions posted in the chat, but if anybody has questions right now, you can come off mute and ask, or you can do it along the way.
All right. Well, I'll keep moving. No, we can always ask questions at the end too, so no problem. So in terms of delivery, all of that, capturing that inventory, prioritizing, setting up the project plan, it's all great. It's going to work, but you want to stop and do something else, which is really do a little bit more of a deep dive and some analysis. And I recommend a proof of concept and build out a proof of concept that's going to verify some of those assumptions we made, right? If you've got 1,000 reports, you're probably not even going to have time to look at all of them. But you're probably going to say, well, these, 100 have very similar characteristics. We've looked at maybe the metadata and done a count of what's got custom SQL built into it, what's got multiple data sources. So if you've done some, assuming, which you're guaranteed to have to do along the way, it's really hard to look at every single report an organization has. So find a sampling. A sampling that maybe is something you've called complex, something you've called medium, something you've called simple. Was it really simple? Did I look at it and say, well, if it only had 2 pages and 5 measures, it was simple? Probably, right? But you want to, just do a quick POC on that to make sure you don't encounter something odd. The complex ones are where you want to maybe dig a little deeper. I recommend doing a POC that is representative of any of the data sources that you're using. If you're using Hadoop, if you're using SQL Server and you're using SAP HANA or any of those, Power BI is going to maybe interact differently with some of those data sources. So doing a POC on at least one of each of those is going to tell you a lot, and it's going to let you stop in your tracks and see if what you're doing is successful. So ideally, you're not 6 months in before you get here, right? You're maybe spending 6 weeks doing some of this inventory. You're setting up the project plan, and somewhere in this time, you've built in at least 2-3 weeks or so to do this POC, so that you're going to be able to find what's going to be challenging and plan for it, and not have it be a surprise to the people who are like, hey, we're going to cut those licenses off, right? And you say, well, no, hold on. We've got to do X, Y, and Z before we can make sure this is going to be successful. So getting out ahead and getting out early on that and doing this deep dive analysis is one of the most important things I think you can do when you go to plan your migration. Testing your performance, testing your refreshes. Are they going to work? How's that going to work? And like I said, getting the right representation from each of your different sources and different complexity levels is really important. So I would say you readjust, right? At this point, you're ready to readjust your timeline a little bit. Add in some data engineering time, right? Add in, time to build out some new views maybe, or something like that. And then I think along with this, and maybe I should have moved that bullet ahead, because one of the things you're going to need is connections and building out that environment. Don't have your resources set up and ready to go on day one and then have them wait 5 or 10 days, because that's how long it takes to get access to this one data source, right? Think ahead on those things and start getting those connections built up. Start building out the gateway so that you can test how they're going to perform early versus at the very end and it doesn't work, right? Getting something on the desktop that works, publishing it up to the service and seeing how it works there. You want to do that, right? How many times have you encountered that DAX measure that works in desktop and you publish and you get the error, memory error, right? You want to get ahead of that and see those. So make sure you've got a workspace and you've got a true environment to do your testing in and to do your development in. So now once you start delivering and start building out your new reports, you know, if you've done this for the POC, you'll have it all hopefully built out and ready to go for your developers to get started. Think ahead too on security groups. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, you know, I recommend doing that in the governance section. Your connections are going to likely, like I said, I recommend using enterprise gateways and making sure you've got service accounts set for refreshing. If you've ever been burned by that, you won't get burned twice, right? The person who has their own personal login, you know, set up in the connection for refreshing, and then they leave the company and everything fails because their user ID is no longer valid, right? You don't want that to happen. Get your service account if you can. Highly recommend that. And then super important, easy to forget, right? But you don't want to start migrating 20 reports and have that development team still working on those reports, making changes, making upgrades, what have you. You're not going to have any success trying to move a moving target, right? So definitely plan. Ideally, you know, that's why I recommend grouping your reports so that you don't want to, you know, take everybody out at once. You know, maybe this group says, I know I can't do any new reporting for this period of time, right? That's ideally how you approach it. So freezing those existing reports. But I would also say that users may be ready to start building new reports in parallel with your migration. Maybe not super early on, but maybe as you get along the way and you're setting things up, I think it's a good idea to anticipate that, because if you're freezing their environments and they can't build new stuff in their existing platform, if that goes on too long, they might get frustrated. But if you give them some of that training we talked about and we start getting them up and ready and maybe running with their own workspaces where they can build out new reports while you're migrating some of their important existing reports, they'll be a lot happier of a user group, and happy users, I think they make happy developers personally. And then now for sure we've talked again, I'm going to talk about governance on the next slide, but you know, plan to really, as you're going through the delivery, part of your delivery should be communication with that governance team, leveraging them to help you communicate with anyone who has an interest in this project.
Okay, there's a question here from Jesse. He says, as you're touching on migration paths, he hasn't yet seen the equivalent in Power BI premium paginated reports. So the equivalent in that of data-driven subscriptions from SSRS server enterprise. And he wants to know if you've had to handle dynamic parameters versus setting up multiple subscriptions to accomplish the same results in Power BI. I'm not sure if that's a question that's directly up your alley or not. If it's not, we can get back to him. But
can we hold that one to the end? I want to ask some questions about the question.
Sure.
Is it written so we can? I'd like to kind of dig a little deeper on it and ask more questions and spend more time kind of elaborating that specific scenario, if that's okay.
Perfect. You put it in the chat and we'll revisit it
Great.
At the end. Thanks.
All right. Perfect. So from a governance standpoint, like I said, if you've already got BI governance, then what you just want to make sure you do is enhance it and add Power BI to it. If you don't already have governance, definitely recommend putting something together that's going to, you know, be a representation of stakeholders, probably some technical resources. You don't want necessarily 20 developers on your governance team, but maybe like a Power BI admin or super user who can represent functionality and represent the technical aspects of Power BI. Stakeholders from various areas who can help decide whether reports belong in Power BI when it comes to discussions about new reports that are being proposed or new workspaces that people want to build. What's going to be an acceptable form of delivery? Are we going to embed reports? I don't have a bullet here for it, but I was thinking about external. Is any of it going to be external facing, accounting for any of that? What are your workspaces? What are your apps? And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend for sure that you use apps as your delivery mechanism for sharing reports on the service and granting permissions at that level versus like giving a user a report link to your workspace. Much more success with your apps. And so kind of talking through with your governance team, what are those apps going to be? Are we going to use mobile? What's going to be, making those decisions is really what you want your governance team to own, and then rolling those out. Defining the resources and roles, making sure you know who's going to represent what area, who's going to do what, and then talking about the process for adding users and adding permissions. And typically what we see done is an AD group gets set up. That AD group gets added to your app permissions. You use the same app, same groups typically if you can for security. Ideally those align. You might have more security groups than you do permission groups, but that's definitely the recommended process to ensure that you're adding people appropriately versus you start adding. If you don't go about this and kind of plan for this, you'll end up with workspaces with 100 people who've been individually added. And then you're going to try to take control of that and go, who's got access to this? Should they all have access to it? Can we make it just one group? And so then you want to move all the people into the group. If you can start out ahead of time with a plan for this, it still can get off track, I promise you, because someone's going to come to you urgently and need to get access. But having a plan for how to deal with that, even the emergencies, having how do we manage it if it's the most important person in the company and they need access in 5 seconds? Well, we need to account for that maybe happening, but what do we do afterwards? We go make sure they're in the group, right? And then we make sure their individual access is turned off so we have a nice clean environment. And then outlining your development process. Are you going to use cloud refresh services? Are you going to upload the models and the data sets? I think there's a lot of good discussion around, what types of technology of Power BI you're going to use, whether it's data flows or data sets, and how to share those. But how do things get promoted? How do they get, do we create a development, a UAT workspace and a production workspace? Do we want to use, what types of things do we want to set up and make sure are already in place for us to move things through the development lifecycle process? And who's going to be the approver of that? And I think I mentioned this, but just making sure what goes into Power BI is an interesting question. What needs a workspace and what is just a quick report? What needs premium and what doesn't need premium? All of your reports may not need to rely on premium, and you may not even be using premium. But if you've got premium, you may not want to always use it for every single workspace, just depending on what how simple or complex something might be. And then very important, tracking your adoption, right? Everything you do here, right? If you garner the support of your user community, if you're reaching out and communicating with them and working with them as you do the migration, as you train them, getting them excited about Power BI, that's going to go a long way to getting that adoption. But don't let it go, right? Ensure that you're continuing to stay on it. And I think tracking that usage, tracking and measuring the engagement. So using your Power BI usage, analytics that you can use to track who's using what and how many reports are being viewed. Figuring out if our reports not being used, if they're reports you want your users to use, maybe we need to drum up some publicity on those reports. If they're reports that, hey, they have not been used for a year, can we turn these off, right? Let's clean things up. Let's keep only what we need. So, so there's less to worry about it anytime we want to make a change. If we change a database platform or something, right? The cleaner you keep things, the easier it is to make those types of transitions. But then that all just really leads to that communication. I think adoption and communication are very integral to go together. We used to implement our reports in Salesforce, and we use Yammer, right? Every time, or Chatter, I think it was Chatter that was in Salesforce. And so anytime we released reports, we'd actually put a Chatter post and describe everything and put a bunch of requirements. Create FAQ pages in your reports. Put, links to measure definitions, or provide users with information, even just within the report, or if you've got one, uniform place that you like people to go to, put out when things are refreshed and how often they're refreshed, right? Nothing worse for a user to encounter and to give up on is if they look at a report and sure, the refresh says the data model refreshed today at 10 a.m., but does that mean everything in the report refreshed at 10 a.m.? Not necessarily, right? Some data in the data source or in the database maybe only got refreshed once a week, even though your model refreshed. So keep in mind, there's a lot of stuff that you're going to want to make sure is getting communicated as you develop Power BI. And then as you roll out new reports, as you make big changes or updates, as you're building out your migration, communicate often. And I mentioned, I just mentioned Chatter, but there's, Slack, or there's Teams, of course, obviously. Maybe create a Teams channel to keep communication, up on people's minds and make posts and give them weekly or monthly. Don't inundate them with too much because you want to keep the attention, but keep an open line of communication and then do, larger communications. Make sure they come from maybe I don't know, they always get the attention, right? If somebody like a CFO is going to be the one to, all of the finance reports are ready. So the CFO generates that email, right? Figure out who the right person is, because they're going to be likely to say, I really want you all to use this report, right? People might give it a listen more than if I, the developer, write that email. So keep that type of thing in mind. So my last slide is on best practices, potential challenges. I've talked about these a lot as we've gone through this already, right? But I think one of the most important things, I haven't touched on it as much, is the data modeling component. And just remember, if you've got a problem like this data's not right, it's not consistent. I get one report from Joe that says this and from Sally it says this. Your tool isn't going to fix that problem. So don't ignore those types of challenges. Be sure you're still staying on top of that even as you do this migration. And you may be able to incorporate fixes for those types of things in your migration plan. You may not, but just have the expectation that Power BI alone isn't going to fix a problem with data accuracy, data consistency. So be sure you're staying on top of those things. If you've got a time for it, build in some engineering, do some remodeling, and you may just need to build out semantic views, right? That's certainly the layer. I've always built out a lot of semantic views on top of the physical model to support whatever tool I'm using, because MicroStrategy likes a snowflake, Tableau likes a wide table, Power BI likes a star, right? So there's, the underlying data is what it is. It may be physical in one way. And you may have a ton of business logic coming in through some custom SQL. Try to push as much of that as you can. If you've got the opportunity to move or shift that from your tool to a semantic view layer, I highly encourage you to do that, because you'll find that it's just going to perform better. It's going to be easier to manage, that type of thing. And then don't forget your training, timely training. Get your users trained, your developers trained, your admins trained. I point out that there's dashboard in a day, admin in a day. There's a lot of built-in training, but a lot of us out there are doing, a lot of our vendors are doing different. We do training, and I know plenty of places are conducting great on-site training or something, obviously more virtual now, but consider that as one of your options for sure. And then take time for performance. And as you look at performance, one of the things I notice is certain tools are just a little easier to pull all of the data back and then start filtering it. I find that for sure in Tableau that I see that a lot. So look for opportunities as you see that to parameterize your data set and, put in limitations. Do I need 5 years, right? Or do I just need the last 2 years? Can I pull 5 years of data and then do incremental refresh? Power BI's incremental refresh capabilities are incredibly powerful. If you've got the date fields and the means to do that, it's definitely something to consider as part of your implementation. For direct query, I highly recommend really digging deep into anything where there's an expectation that you're going to do a live or direct query to ensure you've checked for any things that are going to be challenging, moved it off into a view. Maybe if you absolutely have to use direct query, that is for sure a case for semantic modeling. And then plan for performance tuning of any of that, right? Leverage any of the tuning elements you've got in your various databases, indexes, that type of thing. Plan for some DBA time to help you with that type of thing. And then I've mentioned this, but I really think as you look at some of these reports, you're definitely going to see things that are common and that can be grouped. Look for opportunities to share data sets. Look for, if this one report uses these 6 components and this other report uses 1 of them and this other report uses 3 of them and this one, if you can have the time to do that analysis and kind of whiteboard out or wireframe out how that would work, build one common, model. Even if you're not using something like Azure, you can just build like a common or a data set, share that, publish that data set, and then build your reports with Live Connect and build them off of that so that you're reducing the refresh redundancy as much as possible. And then oftentimes along with that are data flows. I think someone mentioned that earlier, using data flows. I definitely recommend them. They can be a little frustrating sometimes as you build them, but they're worth the value that you get to really drive that in. We just recently, switched. We were hitting SAP HANA on a project recently, and it was taking hours to refresh things, and we moved several things off so that all of it's refreshed this one time. And we actually used Power Automate, and we staggered the refreshes of each of our data flows. I know in some places, I think one of our clients uses like a refresh program. I think it's called Title, where they refresh everything and then kick off the reports. And this may answer, this might be part of what I wanted to talk about, the question Jesse had, but data flows just offer so much opportunity for you to consolidate subject areas. Now, I'll be honest, I've used data flows when I couldn't get at my DBAs, right? When they wouldn't give me time to build a semantic model, I use data flows to replace it. It's not the best practice, but it did build. Every time I went then and worked on the project, my DBAs would come and they'd say, okay, we're ready to build you a semantic view. I'd say, well, here's my SQL, right? I wrote all this, or I wrote this is the logic, and I already had it in one place. And I was using it in 7 different reports, right? And I was, even though the data sets maybe weren't common, I was pushing similar logic for, I think it was like our Salesforce opportunity. We had a lot of logic that we built into how that got processed, and we shared it across different data sets. And that way, every time someone looked at, what is the, I think it was ARR or something like that, right? We had a common measure that calculated that. So really, really big fan of data flows. I've seen it really solve performance problems because when you reduce the redundancy, when there were 20 reports running and they were all running the same stuff over and over on top of each other, right? You clear the space up for things to be a little simpler. Some technical adjustments, just be prepared that you're going to have to change some things. And the types of things I see most often, it's probably going to be formatting. There are certain things that aren't going to be the same, right? We may not even have the same fonts, right? It's as crazy as that. Or it's going to be, I can't adjust column widths manually. You can't set a pixelated column width or something like that. There's going to be some formatting differences planned for those. Make sure your users are ready for that. I hate to see anyone spend, a month arguing over formatting. Let's get it out there early and plan that there are going to be some differences. I know one of the things that really is done differently between Tableau and Power BI is parameters and how those work. Measures, and then they can use parameters, and the way that you could do parameters. Certain parameters are easily replicated in Power BI, but certain ways that they're used, I found they're more challenging, and ideally you can find a solution for a report that may require an adjustment, right? It may require that you visit with the users and ask if it's okay to make this adjustment so that we can really be successful in getting this content to you. Still interactive, still right, essentially the same, but maybe slightly different. I've mentioned direct query a lot, but looking at SQL and performance, if you're using those metadata-based platforms, really anticipate, because if they're writing SQL and things like that, you're just going to have a different environment, right? If you've always had, business objects universe or a MicroStrategy schema that you've built things on, it's going to be a little different because you may not have an entire environment that is just one thing. You might have it broken out into 2 or 3 workspaces or something. So plan for those types of technical differences, and use your governance team to help mitigate those challenges, help you step through them so that your technical resources aren't getting bogged down in arguments. You deliver that up to the governance team and keep working, and then you get some answers, and things get decided upon at that level, and hopefully you get the support you need to at that level. And then building out that regular and formal communication. Build it into your governance plan, stick to it. Don't let it go at the end of the migration. Stay on it as you build out more reports, as you continue to do new development. You'll find that it really makes for a successful adoption, successful users will be excited about what they're doing. If they haven't been before, they sure will once they get to their hands on Power BI, I hope. So, all right. So I think the clear thing is I didn't cover every single thing that's ever going to happen, right? I couldn't possibly anticipate everything that's going to happen, but I certainly thought really hard when Mark asked me to talk about this topic, about things I've seen over 20 years, even if it wasn't migrating to Power BI, right? What in my BI background have I seen happen, and what can you plan for and analyze and get, be sure you're communicating and you're selling it to the folks that you need the support of. And I think from there, if you just start with that type of a foundational plan, I think you'll find that you're set up for success no matter what you encounter, because you're ready for change. And that's probably the biggest message I could give is be ready for a little bit of change, but be ready for improvement as well.